Good evening, and thank you for joining Geography and History of Missouri's Original Prairie Landscape. I'm Lisa Carrico, Director of Family and Veteran Programs for the Missouri Humanities. We are a member-supported organization, and our mission is dedicated to enriching lives and strengthening communities by connecting Missourians with the people, places, and ideas that shape our society. Tonight's presentation is part of our Humanities Outdoors program that explores Missouri's natural heritage, how it shapes our state's identity, how Missourians have shaped and been shaped by its natural surroundings, and the role we have in utilizing and caring for our natural environment. I'm pleased to introduce our two guest presenters for this evening's program, Dr. Walter Schroeder and Carol Davit. Walter Schroeder was raised in Jefferson City, Missouri, and educated at the Universities of Missouri, Columbia, Paris, and Chicago. He is Emeritus Professor of Geography at the University of Missouri and spent his career studying and teaching historical geography and environmental history. Dr. Schroeder is legendary among Prairie supporters for his mapping of Missouri's pre-settlement prairie. Carol Davit is the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation and its Grow Native program. She has edited the Missouri Prairie Journal since 1996 and has worked for 25 years in conservation and environmental fields in communications, development, education, administration, and leadership capacities. Together, they will discuss the past and current importance of Missouri's prairie legacy to our state's natural, cultural, and economic history, and explain the importance of historic landscape mapping to conservation work today. Whether you're watching on Zoom or Facebook Live, we invite you to be part of the conversation. On Zoom, please submit your questions to Walter and Carol using the Q&A button, and use the chat button to submit your thoughts, comments, and answers to our questions. If you're on Facebook, please let us know that you're watching by asking questions and leaving comments. At the end of the presentation, we will try to answer as many questions as possible. If you enjoy this program and would like to learn more about Missouri Humanities, please check us out on Facebook and Instagram. We invite you to learn more about our membership program, where benefits include free books, discounted tickets to special programs, and access to member-only events. Joining is easy. Visit mohumanities.org and click Become a Member. At the conclusion of the program, a link to our program survey will pop up on your screen. We would really appreciate if everyone could take just a few minutes to provide feedback on tonight's presentation. This information helps us shape future programs. It is with honor to turn this over to Carol and Walter. So Carol, take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. Really appreciate the invitation from Missouri Humanities to present this evening, and it's a great honor to present with Walter. I would like to first give an introduction to the Missouri Prairie Foundation. We are a 55-year-old prairie conservation organization and nationally accredited land trust. We protect original unplowed prairie remnants. We create prairie plantings. We run the 21-year-old Grow Native plant marketing and education program, and we administer the Missouri Invasive Plant Council. When you drive in Missouri, you will likely see a lot of grass as you're driving by. And you may see scenes such as the photo on the left and wonder, well, what's the big deal about prairie? There's a lot of grass everywhere in Missouri. Isn't prairie just a lot of grass? Well, the photo on the left is not prairie. It is tall fescue. It's a Eurasian grass that was introduced to Missouri in the 1950s, mostly for cattle forage, but it's used for many other things, turf and other things. And today there are an estimated 14 million acres of tall fescue in Missouri. That's almost a third of our state. The photo on the right, you might drive by that and think that's just a lot of grass. The photo on the right is actually an original unplowed prairie owned by the Missouri Prairie Foundation that happens to be not only one of the most diverse prairies in Missouri, but also the country and the world. In 2018, it broke a world record for plant species diversity on a 20 by 20 inch scale. And this 180 acre prairie has 289 documented plant species. So I show both of these photos to show that prairie is not just grass. It's certainly not tall fescue, but original prairie might look like a lot of grass just driving by, but it's really important to immerse yourself in the prairie if you have the opportunity to walk in a prairie and see how diverse it is. And I will show some slides to help convey that. Ecologists will tell you that prairie is a complex native grassland ecosystem dominated by perennial warm season grasses, wildflowers, legumes, sedges, some shrubs, and less than 10% tree cover. If you were to take all of the remnants of our original prairie and look at all of their plant species in totality, there would be as many as 800 different kinds of plants. There are thousands of arthropods and other invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds that depend on prairie habitat to survive. And there are some that simply cannot survive in a prairie planting. They, for whatever reason, need original unplowed prairie. Even if the same kinds of plants are in a planted prairie, you often won't find the same kinds of pollinating insects that you would on an original prairie. Another great hallmark of prairie is something that we can never see, and that is the root system. Prairies have very complex root systems, and over thousands of years of those root systems growing and decaying, they created some of the richest soil in the world, which is what made Central North America such an agricultural powerhouse, because these prairie soils were so incredibly good for agriculture and so productive. But these prairie roots are important not just for growing row crops but they're important for many other reasons. One being they store large amounts of atmospheric carbon, and they also slow and filter stormwater. So they slow and protect freshwater resources and protect streams. There's not just one kind of prairie in Missouri. Ecologists have actually defined 12 distinct prairie natural community types. I'm going to show you some kind of broad categories of prairie in different parts of the state. And you can see that it looks very different in one area from another. In the extreme northwestern corner of the state, we have less hill prairies, like what you see here in the photograph. These are very steep hills with very dry adapted plants growing on them. We even have prairies near Missouri's boot heel these are sand prairies with a very interesting array of plants and animals that grow on these sandy soils. There are prairies in central and west central and southwestern Missouri, Osage Plains prairies. There are prairies in the glaciated plains that developed on soils in the glaciated part of the state in northern Missouri, such as this Helton Prairie Natural Area owned by the Missouri Department of Conservation. Prairies are a very interesting landscape in that you have a real contrast in aesthetic sort of sensibilities. You have really wide open spaces. You have the sky is very big, but at the same time, if you look down into a prairie, you have this infinite detail of so many different kinds of plants and insects. And it's not just sights, but also sounds. There's incredible detail of sounds of grassland birds and insects. And so you really need to have a close encounter with prairie to fully appreciate it. And like I said before, just driving by a prairie, you can't get the full sense of its diversity and how wonderful it is. The historical prairie region in the United States is, as you see here on the map, these are the traditional prairie regions as you tend to think about them. In Missouri, we are in the tallgrass prairie region where we have ample rainfall to support very tall prairie vegetation. As you go west across the country, the vegetation types correlate with less rainfall. So you have mixed grass mixed prairie, and then shortgrass prairie. Modern prairie, as we think about it today in central part of North America, developed about 8,000 years ago, but it is really millions of years in the making. And Doug Ladd wrote a wonderful article about the history of the natural history of the development of prairie, and that will be shared in a list of resources that will be sent to you following the presentation. In this part of the world, prairie evolved with fire, drought, and also grazing animals. There are many native grassland types throughout North America. As I mentioned, there are 12 different distinct prairie types in Missouri, but there are other kinds of native grasslands besides prairie. In Missouri, we have glades, marshes, fens, and throughout the country, we have coastal grasslands, we have river scours, many different kinds of grasslands. And in this map of the southeast of grassland regions of Eastern North America, you can see the southeast interior grasslands. And you see that it includes the lower third, the southern third part of Missouri. There are glades and prairies in this part of the state that have quite a bit in common with grasslands further to the southeast. And then, of course, we have about 2/3 of the prairie of Missouri in the Midwestern tallgrass prairie and savanna region. Prairie was not an untouched landscape before Euro-American settlers settled on the landscape. There's evidence of Native Americans using Missouri's tallgrass prairies, including this evidence that you see in the photo. An 8,000-year-old shoe made from the rattlesnake master plant was found in a Missouri cave in Callaway County. And the illustration here is of the rattlesnake master plant, which grows on prairies. The climate went into a warming and drying phase between 8,000 and 4,000 years ago, which enabled prairie to spread. But then about 4,000 years ago, the climate entered a wetter phase, which favored woodland over tallgrass prairie. But at the same time, Native American fire practices overrode climate as a factor in perpetuating prairie. The Eastern Plano people of the Archaic Age living in the tallgrass prairie region first started the practice of burning wooded landscapes to encourage the growth of food plants, and this helped perpetuate and encourage grasslands. We don't know the full extent of fire tending of prairies by the Osage or their ancestors in the last 4,000 years, but we do know, based on writings by early Euro-Americans, that Native American use of fire for driving game and encouraging new vegetation growth was carefully planned and organized. Native Americans in Missouri lived in Missouri and helped perpetuate this native grassland ecosystem. At the time of the forced removal of Osage Nation members from Missouri in 1825, more than 1/3 of the state was tallgrass prairie and another third was savanna and open woodland. But this definitely changed. As Bourne wrote in 1820, when the white people settle on a brushy prairie or near them, the Indians recede, fires are seldom seen. And of course, with the forced removal of Osage Nation members, we no longer had those fire practices that perpetuated prairie. Because of the critically important and essential role that Native Americans played in perpetuating and shaping prairie, the Missouri Prairie Foundation has developed an acknowledgement statement. We respectfully acknowledge that the land we work to protect was the homeland of a diversity of Native American nations prior to European American settlement. The land in our care continues to have cultural significance for the Osage, Missouri, Sac and Fox, Iowa, Kaw, and other Native American nations. We are mindful that these nations had a significant role in shaping the landscape and that they continue a sacred relationship with the lands we protect. We recognize and appreciate their contributions to the cultural heritage of this region and to the history of North America. We honor them as we protect the ecological integrity of the lands in our care. What happened to prairie? Well, In 1837, the steel plow was invented, and with that, we saw the rapid conversion of prairie for row crops on those incredibly fertile prairie soils. And as I mentioned, with the removal of Native Americans from Missouri, we saw the cessation of fire, which led to woody invasion of prairies. And where we live and work, our housing developments, roads, shopping centers, schools, and other developments have replaced prairie and other natural landscapes. Saving prairie, we feel, is very important because prairie is part of our shared natural inheritance. Prairie has shaped our economy and our culture. When you think about how much of our economy is dependent directly on agriculture, and then paired with it, so many agribusinesses associated with agriculture, it's really quite significant and has really shaped so much of our culture as well. And all of that is because we had prairie in these rich prairie soils. And also prairie that wasn't plowed that was very important for cattle grazing. And we have a very long tradition of cattle production in our state, which was evident not only in rural areas, but in stockyards in larger cities. It's also important to save prairie because original prairie remnants remain a vitally important habitat for prairie and native grassland dependent plants and animals. As I mentioned, there are certain plants and animals that simply will not live on a planted prairie. They need original prairie. And original prairies are seed sources for the native plant industry. Without original prairie, we can't create prairie plantings. And while we must save prairie remnants, it's really important to create prairie planting as well for habitat for many grassland dependent species that can live on planted prairie, and also for stormwater management, carbon storage, pollinator protection, and for other benefits that they provide for people. So how do we save prairie? First, we have to know where it is. And thanks to Walter Schroeder, we know what we had and we know where to look. And at this point, I would like to turn over to Walter, who is going to give some introduction before we share a clip of a video where he is describing how he developed his interest in environmental history or historical geography. Walter, please.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the beautiful prairies of Missouri and my work in the history of these prairies by the prairie map. I suppose a lot of people are asking what does geography have to do with this, because geography is no longer a required subject in our schools as it is in France and Germany. And in many places it has, what's the word, transmogrified into cultural studies, which is really an appreciation course in how to appreciate the culture without much explanation, and it leaves out the environment. But to me, the core of geography, as it has been for 2,000 years, is to answer the question, what is this place like? And I'm interested in prairies, so I wanted to know what prairies are like. And I've tried to answer that question. And the second question is, how did they get to be that way? Well, the clip shows you my learning in this area from 3 academic institutions, Paris, Chicago, and University of Missouri. But it really is founded in my family background of grandparents, German immigrant grandparents, and my parents nurturing an interest for me and my 2 brothers in the natural environment. So I think we should go ahead with a clip now.
Very good. Will do, Walter. Thank you.
Hey, Carol, there's no sound.
Turmoil, and France was voting communist at that time. But what I remember in this regard, in France, you had to take exams to get out of school, not just accumulate so many hours. And the exam is for geography is with history. You take one exam called Histoire et Géographie, history and geography. And I asked about that. Why don't you have, they said, well, you can't separate the two. They're two sides of one coin. History without geography has no location. It has no setting, no context. It's just like events taking place on a white sheet of paper or something. But geography also, you can't do any explanation in geography. This is the important point. You can't do any explaining in geography without going back into the past and saying, this is how that place, that country, that town, that region got to be the way it is. So that's been with me all my life. At the University of Chicago is where I was introduced to the term ecology. The head of the Department of Geography was a man by the name of Harlan Barrow. And Professor Barrows said, well, you study a plant's relationship with its environment, you study these animals' relationship. So the human relationship with the environment is also ecology. And to me, that was the first way it got involved with humans, the word ecology. Up to that time, it was with the natural world, and now you get humans involved in ecology. And that stayed with me. But to me, geography has always been human ecology. The state of Missouri does not have a doctoral program in geography. We're one of 3 states in the whole 50 United States that does not have a doctoral program in geography. Oh, in order to get a doctoral program, I got mine in history here, who accommodated me because they had by that time recognized a field called environmental history, which I call historical geography. And they allowed me to do a topic in that. My dissertation really is called a historical geography. So it is a geography written in the history department. And I taught them a few things about geography. And then I suppose the course that I enjoyed the most that I developed was a historical geography of the United States. It combined both geography and history. It showed how different peoples had gone into different environments and occupied them and made them productive and tied them in with the rest of the country. Mapping natural vegetation was a concern. I found, and I'm pretty sure it was from Claire Kuchra in the botany department, that he had used the land survey notes in reconstructing vegetation in 3 counties in northeastern Missouri, and he advised me to use those. In retrospect, I don't think there's one American historian who would not say that the land survey was an enabler as much as anything of the settlement of the United States, of getting people on the land. I think the land surveyors are unsung heroes of the American frontier. So we have all this preserved information, and it was spatially preserved by the corner posts. So when the surveyors were walking these straight lines, they made notes of where they left timber and enter prairie. And that was my key to locating where the prairies were. a real trove of information, these land survey notes. So when I got to them, I looked them up in the state capitol building. That's where I told they were, and indeed that's where they were. And some very helpful woman says, well, we keep them over here. She took me over across the marble floor to this room, and I went in. She said, well, here they are. You know, what do you do? And you're looking at, there were 650 volumes. So at that time was when I got to land survey notes. And when I moved into Saline County, I started using the land survey notes. Well, and then from those two counties, it just spread mainly into northern and western Missouri, because that's where the prairie was that I got fascinated by. I said earlier that map was all done on free time. I didn't get any grants. I mean, that's impossible for someone today in a university setting to believe that you would spend all your time doing that with no funding. It was all mine. That really surprised me, how many people are interested in prairies. To me, there's no better evidence of that than to look at the support of the Missouri Prairie Foundation. When I see all these people from urban areas who support the Missouri Prairie Foundation, but people who recognize the historic importance of it and the biological importance of it with its species that you don't get necessarily other places in abundance. Geography to me, ever since I studied in France, is the relationship of man, that means a generic man, to the environment. The original ecology, and you should study the visible product of that, what you see in the landscape as a result of humans relating to the environment and prairies. I like to read stories about prairies. Those are how people can live with the grasslands. Well, there's the map. It was published in 1981, but there's no date on the map. And that's because you can't put a date on the map. It was created basically from the land survey notes. And they started in Missouri in 1818 and finished in Howell County in 1855. And of course, it took a while to do that. There are in total, by the time all the land survey lines had been run, there were 115,000 linear miles of survey done to cover the state of Missouri. 115,000, that's 4 times around the earth, believe it or not, that it took to document the landscape. So it took, of course, over 35 or so years to do the land survey. Of course, a lot of the land surveys were rejected in St. Louis and had to be redone. So for putting a date on it is pretty complicated. Then, of course, there were private lands at the time of the Louisiana Purchase that our government recognized is valid, and they had to be surveyed on the land before you could do the rectangular land survey of township range and section. So that went back to the French surveys of 1798 and going up past the purchase time. So they had a lot of environmental information on them, including location of sinkholes in St. Louis City too. If you ever want to know where the historic sinkholes are, you can go back to those Soulard surveys. The name's pretty prominent in St. Louis, Soulard, which incidentally means is a slang word for drunkard, I believe. Then too, I used soil surveys of counties and geological surveys of counties, which often located historic prairies in them at the time of settlement of the counties, particularly on the interior of sections, because the land survey only had a linear identification of prairies and not in the interior of the sections. So this took another 2 years to read all those sources, and the map was actually finished after 12 years in 1980. Let me go, incidentally, this map as it's shown here does not get into all of the minute detail. There's a lot of little white spaces, non-prairie spaces along valleys that were bled out in the photographic reproduction. The map is at 1 to 500,000, 1 inch to about 8 miles on the land. Let's look to see how some of the groups coming into Missouri and encountering this settlement, this prairie, actually regarded the land. And we'll go first to the French. The French everywhere in the Middle West before the Louisiana Purchase, but whenever they were in the Middle West. Let's go to the St. Louis map here. Yeah, the French established every one of their villages, without exception, their agricultural villages in a prairie. No question about that. St. Louis village, that is where the trading posts were for fur and all that. Of course, we were all on the limestone ridges along the Mississippi River, but they had to have the prairie lands behind, and you can see the common fields, which were laid out in long lots assigned to each villager, identified there. The one called Prairie des Noyers is prairie of the walnuts, and that is where Shaw's Garden, or Missouri Botanical Garden, is today. It was laid out in a prairie, which by then had become overgrown. And then the commons, the pastures used for grazing of cattle, were also in prairies, and they were just called La Prairie. The cattle, les bœufs sont dans la prairie, which would be meaning the commons, the pasture commons. But it's true, and it didn't take long because the French had a regulation against fires, and they had fire suppression out in the prairies behind the village of St. Louis and Carondelet, and they had to prevent fires. And so it didn't take long for the prairies to grow up into brush by time St. Louis started to spread beyond that little village. They were in now clearing brush and small trees. So the French, incidentally, I might say the French were not woodsmen, unlike the Western Anglo-Americans were. The French did not have tree felling axe, believe it or not. They didn't know, they hadn't been able, they weren't able to cut down forest trees. The Americans did. They had a special tree felling axe that they had developed on the East Coast. I actually had roots in Europe, but it was an axe with a curving haft to it or handle to it, and a long handle, and had a narrow head to it with a broad head to it, a heavy head to it, so that when you swung the axe at a tree, it would bounce off. It would not get stuck in the sap of the tree. So it took the Americans to become the woodsmen, and the French stayed behind the prairies. Okay, let's go to the next slide, which is a different group entirely, how they occupied the prairie. In Daviess and Caldwell counties, north and a little bit east of Kansas City, have for the Midwest, if not for all the United States, a unique history. Joseph Smith had identified Jackson County there at Independence as the Garden of Eden for what became what we call the Mormons, or the Community of Christ. And after they were forced to leave Jackson County, Joseph Smith took his band up to Daviess County, particularly Caldwell, where the community of Far West was established. Far West being because as far west as you could get in the United States at that time, without going into Indian territory. But he traveled north up to the Grand River and found a place that he identified as the place where Adam and Eve, when they were expelled from the Garden of Eden in Jackson County, came to live. Place still bears the name, full name Adam Amen, or shortened to Diamond today. It's quite a pilgrimage place today for believers of the Mormon Church. But Joseph Smith, in his written statement, says that the prairie is beautiful, it's bountiful. We won't have any trouble of raising crops in this area, but he said, there's one thing you need to be aware of. The only thing you need to be aware of, he said, was the rattlesnakes. Anyway, the northern half of the Missouri, the glaciated plains had deep, good soils that could be converted by what Carol called, those ways that we destroyed the prairie by cutting out fires, by plowing, and of course by urbanization and overgrazing the land. Almost all of the soils there, one time or another, got to be productively used, and we don't have much in the way of virgin prairie, very little remaining in that area. And then south in Kansas City is another place of the importance of prairies. So we have the state line there at Kansas City, and we need to account for why Kansas City became the premier cow town of the American Midwest. And it all goes back to the state line there, which to me, I called it a demographic dam, because settlers going west could not cross that line into Indian territory for 30 years. And from 1820s, when the line was 1809, when the line was established, all the way up to Kansas statehood. And that was Indian territory on the other side, and you couldn't get legal title to land over on that side. So settlement stopped right there on that state line. So when the trade developed for Santa Fe and California and Texas and all that required herds of cattle, assembling the cattle trains and the settlement trains taking people west. They needed that prairie over there, unplowed, unbroken prairie, to hold their cattle while the brains of the people were over in Westport and Independence putting together these. So while we think of Kansas City as a cow town, it wouldn't have gotten very far without the prairies on the western side. That's why it took precedence over Atchison, Leavenworth, St. Joseph, particularly in the western cattles. What more do we have here? Let's go. The Germans came along the Missouri River Valley, the lower valley, and the first man who really was responsible for attracting German settlements to the settlers to this area was Gottfried Duden. You've probably heard that name. And in one of his letters in 1826, he went up onto the prairies in northern, what is now Warren County, and surveyed them. And he said, "These are wonderful lands, beautiful lands. You won't have any trouble, you German peasants, coming over here and growing your turnips and root crops and wheat." And he says the only thing you have problem with in settling on the prairies was the green flies, the stinging flies. He says a horse on the prairie would die within 4 hours if stung by these flies. But he says those nests are ground nests are easily destroyed when plowing took place on the prairie. Well, we don't have much in the way of prairie left, particularly in northern Missouri. If you go look at those counties, Davis and Colwell counties up there, they're without, as you see on this map, if you can look at the little dots on it, hardly any, well, there's none, I would say, unplowed prairie left in those areas. And that's one thing the Missouri Prairie Foundation would like to work at, is finding more prairie remnants in northern Missouri.
Thank you, Walter. And I would like to show, these are the prairies that the Missouri Prairie Foundation owns and manages. You see Walter's pre-settlement prairie layer on this map. And the red stars are the 29 properties that the Missouri Prairie Foundation owns and manages, thanks to its members and other financial supporters. So we have 29 tracts of land totaling more than 4,100 acres. And we are known for really intensively managing these sites, very vigilant about controlling invasive species. And we burn one third to one half of each tract annually, leaving a portion as a refuge for overwintering insects and other animals, but following in the footsteps of Native Americans before us. Our prairies are open to all to enjoy, and there are, as Walter said, more prairies out there to protect. And with your support, we can save even more, and you can learn more about us at our website, I think on the next slide. We have a number of resources compiled for you to learn more, and Lisa will be sending these with direct links. But here you see a graphic of the cover of Walter's publication that has the maps, and this is available at the Missouri Prairie Foundation website. We also have an article creating a prairie map of Missouri that Walter wrote several years ago, as well as articles with those graphics that you saw about early prairies of St. Louis and Kansas City. The clip of the video you saw today was an excerpt from a 13-minute video called A Conversation with Walter Schroeder. It's available at our YouTube channel. We also created about, I don't know what it was, Walter, 2 or 3 hours of archival video of more from Walter, so we can have that good documentation. I mentioned this article before, Ancient Players, New Game, The Origins of Our Tallgrass Prairie, and that's available on our website as well. And just this year, Tallgrass Prairie and the Osage Nation in Missouri article written by Dale Blevins, the Prairie Foundation's immediate past president. And the time to save prairies is truly now. The specs on the map that you see here in the earlier slide are indeed, it's a sobering image to see how little original prairie is left. But you can tell from the images that I showed you, the images that I showed of prairie, those are each a speck on the map, and they are vibrant, beautiful prairies that still exist to save and protect. And you can learn how you can help at moprairie.org. And in addition to protecting original prairie remnants, which is vitally important, it is also incredibly important to put native vegetation back on as many parts of the landscape as we can where we have developed it. You can use plants native to prairies and other habitats in Missouri, in home landscaping, on farms, city parks, schoolyards, to support pollinating insects, songbirds, and other wildlife and home landscaping, and so forth. And you can find many resources to help you at grownative.org. And I believe that is our last slide, Lisa.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you both, Carol and Walter. Walter, there's a couple just little shout outs to you in the chat. So I thought it might be kind of fun to read a few of those to you really quick. Dr. Schroeder, I'm actually a new geography faculty at Mizzou Geography, excited to learn of your work here. Hello, Barry here. I took an introductory geography course from you in the early 1960s at the University of Missouri. My father was Reverend August E. Berge from New Haven. I believe you had a family connection to some folks in New Haven. And there was one other gentleman that was also one of your geography students. Let's see, 2002 semester paper on most Missouri springs and settlement. Glad to see you're still around and spreading the word on relating people and resources. I am too, best wishes. I just thought those were fun to share. So I do have a question for you before we open this up to the audience. And it kind of ties in nicely with a question from Arthur. What makes geography one of the humanities? And my question to you is, what role do you feel the humanities can play in helping save and protect prairies? So Walter, I don't know if you want to kind of address the geography as one of the humanities and then how the humanities can play a role in helping save and protect prairies.
Well, thank you, Dr. Merhoff, for the interest in the question. I'm not sure I would put geography as an academic subject, as a fundamental research discipline, as a humanities. I never thought of it that. I think we can contribute a lot to the humanities, particularly as people study the cultural landscape, as quite a few geographers do, interpreting what an urban landscape looks like, and from its visible features on the street and how it got to be that way, and how it attracts people to look at it and so forth. But I don't think of, well, let me add to that. Geography has, I think, for some schools, transmogrified into cultural studies, which is really a humanities. I think people think that you learn geography by learning other cultures, and that's really a cultural appreciation class, such as art appreciation and music appreciation. You can appreciate different cultures. then that way it's humanities, but that's not the geography I know. And how can humanities help? Well, I think, let me go back to an experience I had. My brother and I took some scouts to Philmont, and we agreed that the students should have the experience of sleeping out under the stars in a prairie. This was more of a mid-grass in prairie in Oklahoma, and just feel the senses that you get when you, no tent, just sleep out under the stars with your sleeping bag. And all of them commented on that, what a wonderful experience it was. You need to develop a feeling towards the prairie environment. I'm not sure how best to do that. Well, let me give another example. If I can, this I'll compress. But just after Prairie State Park was opened, the state park director at that time took me on a personal tour there. And we got to a place hiking through that, and he spread his arms out, and almost as though he was invoking some oracle from heaven, he said, "Walter, look at this, isn't this remarkable?" I said, what? And he says, "You cannot see any sign of humans anywhere from this point. No sounds, no telephone lines." He says, this is like the original. And I thought, gosh, this director of state parks is really taken in with the senses as he stood out in a prairie. And I think this kind of feeling that you can get by being out in an open prairie is something you can't get any other place.
Lisa, I wonder if I could chime in just a bit too regarding your question. And I think humanities plays an enormously important role in protecting prairies and other natural resources, because could we not say that humanities is the human experience? I mean, that would be maybe a very broad view, but if you were to visit a prairie and then you wanted to tell someone about your experience, you're putting your human perspective on that experience through speaking or through writing or through a painting, or so human expression is critically important in protecting our natural resources.
I absolutely agree, Carol. And I think even earlier this evening, Walter, you even mentioned, I don't remember if, I think that was in your documentary, but surrounding yourself with stories about prairies. So I think that's also that humanities shaping, hearing stories and feeling that connection. We have a few minutes for a couple questions. So we'll just kind of jump around, and Carol or Walter, feel free to chime in. How much land minimally does one need to have it considered to be a prairie? I've seen quite small and contained patches on hillsides, glades with original plants, but wouldn't know if it's okay to call these prairies.
Walter, I might just mention something and then feel free to jump in. That can be a tricky thing to figure out. But so I'll tell you this photo you see here. This is a 40-acre prairie remnant, and we definitely call that a prairie. And it is part of an area that was once 4 miles wide. And along the Mississippi River, you can find, and Missouri River for that matter, you can find little hill prairies. We own a 20-acre piece of land, a Luss Hill Prairie, that has, the Luss Hill Prairie is maybe 3-4 acres. It is a prairie remnant. But I do want to point out that while these are dramatically smaller than they once were, they can still be very vitally important habitat. We manage an original prairie remnant within the city of Joplin. And on this property is a 3/4 of an acre original unplowed prairie. And on that little tiny place, a native bee was found that most bee specialists have never seen before. And the male of this species has never been described by science, yet it is living on 3/4 of an acre. So in terms of, for supporting many other kinds of wildlife, of course, bigger it can be better, but we will never discount any patch of prairie that we can save. And it's also important to remember that in terms of glades, which I don't think Walter necessarily mapped in the Ozarks, so many of those grasslands were always isolated. They are found within a wooded context. And so many glades were always naturally isolated, but within these open woodlands. I don't know, Walter, if you'd like to add anything.
Yes, you touched on it, and that is that we get into a problem of terminology here. When is a prairie a prairie? The word prairie is French, and there are no prairies essentially on the other side of the Appalachian Mountain. They have grasslands, but they're called something else, meadows chiefly. And it wasn't until people crossed the Appalachians that they found the French were already there and had named the land and were using the word prairie for these grasslands, and they more or less adopted that, except some brought barrens into the state. Had the French not been here, this organization could be called the Missouri Meadow Foundation instead of Missouri Prairie Foundation. But there are mapped and called prairies, some openings in the Ozarks around, particularly when I think of the Shawnee campsite in Shannon County in the middle of the Ozarks, which has always been called a prairie, and it's not more than a few acres. And I don't know how it got that name, but yeah, we have glades and barrens and other names that could be very, very small in area. I can't tell what size. We have reconstructed prairies around schools here in Boone County. 2 Mile Prairie School, for instance, I was in on the establishment of what they call their prairie, which is much less than an acre in land, but so be it. It's a prairie.
So I have one, if maybe Carol, you can take this question quickly, and we will wrap up. Kind of going with the remnant prairies, you noted that a planted prairie does not support all the plants and animals that a prairie remnant does. Can you expand on a prairie remnant by planting the land around it, and will plants and animals expand into that planted area?
Sometimes, but a prairie is not just the plants, it's also the soil. And there are soil microbes in original prairie soil that you simply cannot find in plowed up prairie. In fact, there were soil scientists in Colorado who found an entire phylum of bacteria in prairie soil that was completely absent from an area that had been plowed up. So it's not just the plants, but it's also the soil microbes, which are important in many ways we don't even understand yet for the whole prairie ecosystem. And there are a number of plants that simply, as my colleague Alan Brandhagen says, defy cultivation. and also it's very difficult, time consuming, and pretty darn expensive to try to propagate all of these really rare species and have them in a planted area.
Thank you, Carol. One quick question for Walter. What is your favorite prairie on the whole entire earth?
I don't have a favorite prairie. We're talking about, I think if I restricted it to Missouri, I would say the one that I have visited most and done research in it, trying to find topographic irregularities on the surface, trying to find old buffalo wallows in it that were described by some of the early persons who crossed the Grand Prairie of Missouri. And that is Tucker Prairie. And I think if my family documents hold up, that Tucker Prairie was, saving Tucker Prairie was a part of the early formation of the Missouri Prairie Foundation by Christensen and Crawford, because I-70 was being planned and it took off part of that virgin prairie, Tucker Prairie in Callaway County. And they refused to move it even farther away to restore that part that they took off to build I-70. And that aroused people to the loss of prairies in the state, virgin prairies, unplowed prairies.
I knew that was going to be a hard question for you. I want to thank everyone that tuned in tonight. Special thanks to our presenters, Walter and Carol. It has been such a great joy putting together this program and learning more about Missouri's prairie legacy. I know through our comments tonight that there's been a lot of appreciation for this and a lot of newly learned information. So this presentation will be available to view on our website and on Facebook. So feel free to rewatch and share. We would love to hear your thoughts on tonight's program. A link to the program survey will show up in the browser when the webinar ends. I'll also send a follow-up email with the companion program resource guide and that survey link. If you'd like to learn more about our programs or like to consider becoming one of our members, please visit mohumanities.org. I hope tonight's program has inspired hope and motivation to get out and protect our prairies. This concludes Geography and History of Missouri's original prairie landscape. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, Walter. Good night, Lisa.
Good night, Carol. Good night, Walter.